Welcome to the message for today. I was going past a train station the other day and was just thinking how quick 2020 has been. We're almost already 6 months into the year. I remember back in the day when it was like a train approaching the station and all with anticipation and expectation of what 2020 was going to be like. And suddenly it's rounded the corner and we've had to face droughts and bushfires and floods in some areas. Then the COVID-19 stuff hit. People lost jobs, there was uncertainty about the economy, we haven't been able to do things that we normally do. And then 2020 sort of arrived at the destination and we get this sense that all of life has been turned upside down. There's a degree of uncertainty that 2020 has brought with all of the challenges that we have. And in a sense, all of life is like that, whether we face COVID-19 or not. But it just brings a complicated nature of it. And is it like the train then pulls out of the platform and we head to the future? What does that future look like? At least at the moment, they're talking about a roadmap out and navigating through the new normal and what looks like the way forward. But what does that look like for us? Not just as a country, but as individual people. How do we get a sense of certainty about what that future looks like? How do we know we're on the right track? Are we on the right track? Is there a sense of a warning light or something that we can know of how our behaviour is or how we respond to things that are going on? If we try to look to the future and it looks a bit fuzzy or out of focus, how do we sharpen up our sense of what the future looks like? What are the sort of things in our lives that we can put together to give us a sense of hope and expectation for the future, no matter what it holds? Is there a sense of some warning lights that we can have on the tracks that we're on that perhaps gives us a warning, a red light or a green light? Today in our series Messed Up, we're going to have a look at the story of Esther, someone who did face an uncertain future, but with the things that are going on around her and the lessons that we can learn from her life, there's a great deal that I think will give us confidence and assurance about what we go into the future. Let's have a look at Esther. So to have a look at some of those roadmaps to get a sense of a way forward and what track we need to be on in order to navigate the new normal going forward, I want to have a look at the story of Esther. Esther is set way after the time of the glory days of Israel, after King David and King Solomon. The kingdom of Israel split. Babylon came and invaded Israel and many were sent into captivity. That's the time of Daniel. And then after that, the kingdom of Persia attacked Babylon and annexed it. So Persia was this huge kingdom that many of the Jews lived in, sometimes in the cities that they controlled and sometimes in other places. Sometimes at times they were let go back to Jerusalem. So this story is set in the time of King Xerxes, and sometimes we'd say these names and people really don't know what they're like. So I've put a few pictures together just so we can get a visual of what some of these people would have looked like. So the first one is this is King Xerxes. This is Xerxes the king. Now this is a recreation of what it would have looked like from ancient findings of pictures of him. And King Xerxes, we see in Esther chapter 1 verse 1, it says, "This is what happened during the time of Xerxes, the Xerxes who ruled over 120 provinces stretching from India to Kush," which is the equivalent today of like Ethiopia and Sudan, around that area. So it was a huge kingdom. And so King Xerxes was having this massive party, and it wasn't, just a fruit punch and Vegemite sandwiches type of party. It was a real drinking party. He had all these officials around, and he was quite proud of his wife, and so he decided to call her in. And after 7 days, quite drunk, the king summons Queen Vashti. Now this is an oil painting from way back, one of the masterpieces that someone depicted Queen Vashti. So the king thought it would be a good idea for her to come in wearing her crown in front of all his friends, wearing nothing but the crown. And she didn't think that was a very good idea. We read in Esther 1 verse 12, But when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. The king became furious and burned with anger. So Queen Vashti becomes not just Vashti the queen, but Vashti the ex-queen. She's deposed, and so the king decides he has a good idea for a reality TV show. Long before the farmer wants a wife, he comes up with this idea of the king wants a wife. So he has a search all through the kingdom for the best looking women in order to be his new queen. So then we have Esther, Esther the beauty queen. Now this isn't really Esther, but this is a picture of Chewie from my favourite K-pop group Twice, and she was voted last year the world's most beautiful face. So it's like what happened back in the day. Esther was a Jew. Now we read about Esther in Esther chapter 2 verse 7. We read this. Mordecai, we'll talk about him in a minute, had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This girl was also known as Esther, was lovely in form and features. And Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. So she was probably just a little girl when her mother and father died, and Mordecai took her on and raised her as his own. Now he was an official in the king's court. He'd stayed there when many others had gone back to Jerusalem. And the king was obviously captivated by her beauty, and of all the people in all the kingdoms that came, Esther was the one that caught his eye, and Esther became the new queen. Then we have Mordecai. Mordecai was the key Jewish leader in this area. And we read about Mordecai. This is again a picture of him from an oil painting of what he would have looked like as this wise old Jewish man. But he was also a loyal man to the king. And on one occasion he was wandering around. He overheard a couple of guards in the king's palace plotting to overthrow him. So we read in Esther 2 verse 22, Mordecai found out about the plot to assassinate the king and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, the two officials were hanged on the gallows. And this is recorded in the book of the Annals in the presence of the king. So Mordecai is a key person in this whole story. The final person that we're going to talk about is Haman, and I've called him Haman the Horrible. So if you're into TV series, particularly Battlestar Galactica, you might recognise him as Dr. Baltar, and he appeared in the Christian movie One Night with the King that talks about this story of Esther. So Haman is a guy who, his ego is bigger than the whole world, and he thinks it'd be a good idea to get people to bow down to him. That's the sort of person that he was. So he makes a decree that everyone should bow down to him. And Mordecai, being a good Jew, he will not bow down. He believes in the one true and living God, and that's the only God for him. So this gets Haman really, really upset. We read in Esther 3, when Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel or pay him honour, he was enraged. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, they were the Jews, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all of Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. So that's all the characters. Now this is how the story develops. So here's how the story develops. As we saw, Haman gets really upset that Mordecai won't bow down to him or worship him as he wants. So he tricks the king. He says, oh look, there's this group of people who are not doing what you say, and I think we should exterminate them. And the king sort of agrees with that. Haman, I don't think, tells him the whole story. And of course this is his way to get back at Mordecai, and he's just looking for any way possible to be able to do this. And then on one occasion the king can't sleep. He's sort of having a restless night. He gets up and he asks one of his aides, let's read from the annals of the king. Tell me the things that have gone on, because there's so much happening in the kingdom. It spreads so far and wide. So one of the stories that's read is about how Mordecai saved his life. And he says, what's been done to honour this man? Oh, I don't think anything. We haven't recorded it. So the king Xerxes goes to Haman saying, what do you think should happen to someone who honours the king? And Haman, of course, thinks he's talking about himself. And he says, oh, that person should be honoured. The king says, great, go and honour Mordecai because he saved my life. And this makes him, he's angrier than a killer hornet. He's just really aggro. So he's looking for ways and ways in order to really get back at Mordecai. And finally, he gets wind of this, and it's really getting serious. He's actually starting to build gallows to hang Mordecai on, and it could be a potential extermination. I mean, enough had happened to the Jews, but if this history, way back had been done, the Jews would have had no history whatsoever, and it was a really dangerous situation. So this is when Mordecai goes to Esther, because she's in this royal position, and he utters that statement. I'll talk about it in a bit more detail later, but I think it's one of the greatest statements. Who knows, he says to his young cousin, to his stepdaughter in a sense, who knows that you have come into the world for such a time as this? Maybe God's put you in this position for a reason. So she says, okay, if I perish, I perish. She says, let's fast. And she gets all the people around her that know who she is to fast. And then she does a risky move. She approaches the king. Now, normally, you can only approach the king if you're asked to do. But she sort of bursts away in and says, King, I'd like to throw a banquet for you. Okay, so he agrees with that. And she throws the banquet. It's a great success. And the king says, you've done so well. You've been such a loyal companion. Ask whatever you want. There's something obviously going on. And she says, there's people that are out to kill not just me, but all my people. And the king is horrified, and she says, he says, who is it? And she says, it's Haman. And of course, he's horrified that his plot has been found. The king goes out in anger about what he's just been told. And while he's out, Haman goes back to Esther and goes back to the royal seat that she's been on, and puts himself at her feet and kneels down. And when the king comes in, it looks like Haman is actually attacking Esther. And he's so enraged, he orders Haman to be executed on the very gallows that he built in order to execute Mordecai. Thus the story finishes. And it's a great story because Queen Vashti, we believe, was the mother of Artaxerxes, who was the son of Xerxes. And he was the one when people like Ezra, if you know that story, and Nehemiah that rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem, he oversaw that effort that saw the rebuilding of Jerusalem to what we have today in order to have the preparation for Jesus to come. But there's even more to the story than that, as we keep saying. And I want to personalise that and look at some of the key things that come out of the story of Esther that talk about, as we've been saying, this road forward. What does it look like out of COVID-19, but just even into the new areas of our life where we've never been before? So there's some key learnings that I want to talk about now. So let's see what we learned. So if we're going down a new track, if we're going down a situation where we've never been before, the first lesson that I want us to pick up from the story of Esther is this. It's the dangers of idolatry. The red light on the track that we think we're going down, one of the things we need to learn is the danger of idolatry. Now, we see idolatry in operation more in our world than I think we realise. Idolatry is when we set something or someone, even ourselves, up as worthy of praise and worship and attention. We want people to act in certain ways towards us that we think are worthy of our position as people. And as I said, it happens more than we think. In the Old Testament, God has talked about that as, in the Ten Commandments. And we read in the book of Exodus, you must not make for yourself an idol of any kind or any image of anything in heavens or on the earth or in the sea. You must not bow down to them and worship them. So the first part of that actually says you must not make for yourself an idol. And sometimes I read that, when you're reading something really quickly, you miss out a word. And sometimes you can read that as, you shall not make yourself an idol. And that's really what happens a lot of times in our world. Idolatry, I believe, is the sin behind a lot of sins. It's that basic idea that we have where we set ourselves up to be an idol. We want people to act certain ways towards us. In fact, we demand it. We demand it. We also call it the world revolves around me syndrome. And we see it operating in this account of Esther. We see it in King Xerxes, who demanded his wife do certain things that would have been terribly embarrassing, to appear naked before all his friends, but that's what he demanded. We see Haman wanting people to bow down and worship him. We see it in our world, in ourselves. We demand our spouse, our children, our world. We want people, we want things to be as we want. We demand that. And in the end, it's idolatry. The world revolves around it, and we might do it. We might do it in aggressive ways. We might do it in passive-aggressive ways. But many times we are putting ourselves in place of God because we want things, we want people, we want circumstances, and when it doesn't happen, we demand it of everyone else. People should treat me as I want. God should do this for me sometimes, because that's what he does, surely. But we've already been warned not to make ourselves, or not make for ourselves, an idol even for ourselves. And we see the danger of that in the book of Esther. When people start to act like that, what happens? And we see it in opposite in the attitude of Esther that we'll look at later, where she said, if I perish, I perish. This is something that I need to do. So those red lights down the track, when we start to, I know it's frustrating in going through what we're going through. I know it's frustrating where the world is not acting like we want. It's frustrating because the world is not cooperating with our needs and desires. But we've got to be careful not to make an idol of ourselves and want and demand other people and other things and the world and the government and everything else to act as we want. Just beware of the danger, that red light on that track of idolatry. The second point I want to make about the story of Esther is about the importance of God's sovereignty. The importance of God's sovereignty. One of the things we see in the book of Esther that's it's controversial, has been controversial over the years as even a book of the Bible, because the name of God does not appear in Esther. The name of God does not appear. There's not, apart from the fasting, and we assume that's fasting and prayer, but the name of God doesn't. Now, I didn't say that God doesn't appear, because that's the thing with God's sovereignty. Sometimes we call it coincidence. I love this definition, that coincidence is the timing of events and places being put together, obviously done by the hand of God, for which he chooses not to take the credit. Sometimes we call coincidences a God incidence. Now that doesn't mean, I'm not saying that everything that happens like that is evidence of the hand of God. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes things just happen. And sometimes we're guided, I think, too much by circumstances. But what we see in Esther is that even though the name of God doesn't appear, God himself, we can see him behind the scenes doing all sorts of things. We see, was it just coincidence, or was God in it, that he helped Mordecai overhear the plot against the king? Was it just coincidence that the king couldn't sleep that particular night and had the annals of the king read to him, where he heard again the story of Mordecai saving him? We see the hand of God in so many circumstances that even though poor old Esther had lost her parents at a very young age, brought up by an elderly uncle, and yet it was the hand of God that she was made in beautiful form and features, as the Bible says, that brought her into that royal position. And even though the name of God doesn't appear, God's hand is everywhere. God's fingerprints are all over the book. As one author says, he is here and he is not silent. And if you look at that, and I just want to encourage in this, again, thinking of this idea of going forward, to understand that sometimes the things that have happened in life, the past that has brought us to where we are now, and the things that will go forward with us into the future, we just need to be aware of the hand of God and the importance of God's sovereignty. We might not see it. We might look around and something's happened and you go, oh, and God's going. In the New Testament, Paul talks about we are created, we are God's masterpiece, created in Christ Jesus to do good works which God prepared in advance for us to do. And it's this wonderful idea that God has orchestrated the events of our lives. We might not see it, we might not be aware of it, we might be totally oblivious to it, but God has guided us and led us, and there's been all sorts of circumstances that have happened in our life that have brought us to where we are now. And we need to be very much aware of God's leading and guiding in these places in our lives, and even going forward. And that leads us to a really important third point. So the third point I want to make is about the power of destiny. The power of destiny, that sense that as Mordecai says to his young cousin Esther, I'll read the whole passage now. He says in Esther 4 verse 13, "Who knows but you have come to royal position for such a time as this?" Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai, "Go gather all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days and nights. I and my maids will fast as you do. And when this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." Now, how inspiring is that? That Mordecai, who has seen Esther grow up from a young child, and yet all the circumstances of life, all the good things that have just happened to her and the bad things that happened to her earlier, he's saying, this could be your destiny. All of the circumstances of life, all of the things that have happened to you, all of this is combining now. Because frankly, a lot of life is not like that. A lot of life is just going down the track from one place to another. But as we saw previously, if God's sovereignty is there and we're aware of that and we know how important that is, that we know that God is in the mundane things of life as much as He is in the miracles of life. And Esther is able to get that sense in her that all of her life has been coming to this moment. And she needs to have courage and take on the responsibility that she has. This is the time that you have come into the world for such a time as this. This is your time. This is your place, he says. And she says, I'll do it. What if we lived like that in this new era? I mean, it was a dangerous situation for her. She was hiding her real nationality as a Jew. She was going to go to the king, which normally was illegal, and she would have been, killed if he was in a bad mood. But what if we, in this way forward, if we got beyond our idolatry, we didn't expect the world and everyone around it to act towards us in the way that we wanted? What if we really understood the sovereignty of God and just understood that in big moments and small, in mundane and in the miracles that sometimes come, God's hand has been at work to guide us. Therefore, our destiny could be this moment. The people that we run into, the phone calls that we have, the circumstances that come our way, we get a strong sense that, hey, maybe God could be in this. And God is using everything in my background, my experiences, the good things and bad things that have happened to me, and God could be using this very moment to use me as part of His plan that He's working in that overall purpose. What if we lived every moment like that? As I said, a lot of times it's not like that. It's just the mundane. We just go through the motions, and there's a lot of that just faithful stuff that we need to keep up. But every now and again we get to the station. We get to those moments where there's an intersection. We can go one way or another. And as we've been saying, said early on in this lockdown, it's the decisions that we make today that allow us to tell the stories that we want to tell tomorrow. That we remained strong, we were faithful, we were uncertain, we didn't know what was going on sometimes. But we didn't internalize the behaviour. We allowed God to work and saw his hand, and then we went forward with courage and with confidence. And if we saw that in everything that we do, where we live, the people that are in our lives, everything about us is not an accident. God has been working even when we haven't seen it, even when we haven't been aware of it. I was going to say before that in terms of the hand of God, we know that birds are able to see a whole spectrum of the light atmosphere that we can't. There's a whole lot of UV light that they're able to see that humans just can't. And in the same way, there's so many of the things of in the spiritual realm that we're not aware of, that we don't see. And sometimes we can only see it as we say, hindsight is 20/20 vision. We look back and say, I think God was in that. That thing that I thought was going to be the worst thing in the world turned out to be a blessing in disguise. So as we go forward, I really encourage you to have a heightened sense of the awareness of God in your life, that everything that God is bringing towards would be something that could be a blessing in your life and your family's life. And often it's that expectation that we have that's different to what God really wants to bring that purpose. And it's a matter of submitting our will to his and not demanding that other people do that. So in the way forward that is tough, that is hard, that is difficult, I pray you'd learn those lessons from the book of Esther. That you would remember remember the danger of idolatry. That you don't be a demanding person that demands everyone else and the world itself to revolve around you. That you would remember that God has been in the circumstances and the things in your life in ways that you're probably not even aware of. And you're aware of the sovereignty of God and the importance of that. But you also tap into the power of destiny. That you could have come into the world for such a time as this. That the position God has put you in this family, in this situation, is not by accident. The fact that you're listening to this today is not an accident. That God wants to use you to achieve his purposes until we all get to that place that is into the future. Heaven, where none of these uncertain things will be there and all the bad things that we have now will be done away with. As always, I'd love to connect with you and see how you're going in your life. If you need help in understanding your next steps in your path towards God, we'd love to connect with you as a church. It still could be a while until we meet, so continue to meet in this way, in a virtual way, through YouTube, Facebook. All my contact details are up there. I'd love to connect with you if I can help. Thanks for tuning in today again, and God bless.